Okay, well, we're going to keep going in Ezekiel, and I'm not going verse by verse, but it's at the beginning here we're kind of having to a little bit because there's just a lot of stuff to get through. So it might look like that, but we're not going to literally hit every verse in the whole book of Ezekiel. I don't want you to think that this is going to be, every single verse. Some stuff that we need to look at it jumps out, but most of it's going to be kind of more concepts, and we're going to talk about the stuff that is important for us to not miss. So we're going to keep on today. So we kind of ended last week. We were talking about the chariot throne. What else do we talk about? You guys remember?
Was it when they had the eyes and the wheels?
We talked about that, yeah, part of the throne and the wheels, and we talked about the Temple of Solomon and the comparisons between the throne and the Temple of Solomon. And so we're going to kind of talk about the one sitting on the throne this week, which, no surprise, who is it? God, right? The God of Israel, Yahweh. And so we're going to look a little bit into that today, but I want to show you a few things that kind of would have maybe resounded in Ezekiel's mind as he sees this, okay, as this is happening. So here's Ezekiel 1, verse 26, okay? And it says, "From above the expanse that was above their heads, there was the likeness of a throne, looking like a sapphire. And above the likeness of the throne was a likeness similar to the appearance of a human on it, but above it." Okay, so he sees the throne, and he says above them, he's talking about those cherubim. And then he sees this. Now, what jumps out to you about the person sitting on the throne? Human. That's huge. So Ezekiel sees this, and it's not like this wispy thing, It's not like that he can't recognize what form it is. He says it looks like a human. It has a human form to it. So I want to talk about this for a minute because this is not new. Okay, we think a lot of times, or we're taught maybe, that God showing up in human form is like a brand new thing per the New Testament. Christianity created it. It's part of the New Testament. It is not. It's been around in the Old Testament long before the New Testament arrived. Okay, so Ezekiel would not have been, it would have been foreign to him to have this idea that God could show up in human form. That's not new to him. He's very familiar with that. Okay, so just a few things to know. You have a lot of instances in the Old Testament where God is described with human language, human features, human factors. Now, we know God is spirit. We're told that, right? But how do we get from there to him being identified in human characteristics? Are they just trying to make him more human so that we can understand him, or is there more to it than that? That's
we
kind
were
of
made in the image of God.
That's true. So what did he use for his base? I mean, when he said, "Okay, let's figure out how we're going to make these humans," what did he use for the guiding, principle of that? Well, it made him in his image, right? So there must be something there. There must be something there. Okay. Understanding that the God of Israel would take the form of a human was not new to Ezekiel. Okay, it's not a Christian invention. In fact, here's that verse, Genesis 3:8. "Then they heard the sound of God," and what was he doing?
Walking.
Does that sound like human language? He was walking in the garden at the windy time of day, right, in the cool of the day, is what it might say. And so what's he talking about? Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve are hiding at this point, and God comes walking through the garden. Did they have a very close relationship with him as human beings where it wasn't just this wispy thing where they heard from heaven? Did they have more of a personal walk with him in a sense where they could actually spend time with him? I wonder what that looked like. Look at Deuteronomy 23, verse 14. It says, "For Yahweh your God is walking." There's that. It's the same word that's in Genesis. Okay, same word. "About in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to hand your enemies over to you before you. And so let your camp be holy, so that he shall not see in it anything indecent, and he shall turn away from going with you." Now, you could take this more like metaphorically. Well, he's walking means he's just going with us. Is it possible he was actually walking in the camp? At one point, when they get very, into idolatry, we'll say, God ends up telling Moses, "I want you to take my tent and I want you to move it outside the camp. I can't be inside it anymore. It's full of idolatry, full of, Baal worship. They had the cows set up, the calves and stuff." He says, "Move me outside." And so there's actually even usage in Hebrew of, when it talks about the temple, and having a place to rest, and it talks about him walking about in the temple. Walking about. It's that same phrase, going about, but it's actually the same word, walking. So it kind of gives you some of that human language where, what does it mean he was walking about in their midst? What does it mean he walked in the garden with them? These are all human terms, okay? Now, Genesis 18, this is when Abraham is about to find out they're going to have a baby, right? Sarah's, going to have a baby at old age. It says, and Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, and he was sitting in the doorway of the tent at the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes, and he saw, and behold, 3 men were standing near him, and he saw them and ran from the doorway of the tent to meet them, and he bowed down to the ground. What's going on? Abraham sees these guys, and who does he know it is? It's Yahweh. Now, it's interesting because he knows it's Yahweh who appeared to him, but in what form? Human being, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of examples of these. I'm just giving you a few. Here's in Genesis 32. That night he arose and took his wives, this is Jacob, his 2 female slaves, his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok, and he took them and sent them across the stream. Then he sent across all his possessions, and Jacob remained alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of dawn. And then who does he come to find out the man is? God. They have a wrestling match. You have all of these instances where God shows up in human form. Okay? And it's kind of a weird thing to think about that God would do that. But he does. And he does it many times. Exodus 24. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 from the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel, and what was under his feet. That sounds like human form, doesn't it? Was like a sapphire tile work, and like the very heavens for clearness. And toward the leaders of the Israelites he did not stretch out his... Okay, these are all human terms, okay? And they beheld God, and they ate and they drank. So what happens? Moses goes up on top of Mount Sinai with the elders, and they literally have a meal with God. And there's all this language about a human form under his feet. Now, he sees something that looks kind of like what Ezekiel saw, doesn't he? He sees this platform. Under his feet was like sapphire tile work. He sees this clear crystal base. That's exactly what Ezekiel saw above the cherubim that are pulling that chariot throne. Okay? But again, more language about his hands and his feet. And goes on to say this. Moses took the tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and he called it the tent of assembly. And all seeking Yahweh would go out to the tent of assembly, which was outside the camp. And at the going out of Moses to the tent, all the people would rise and stand, each at the opening of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. And at the entering of Moses into the tent, the column of cloud would descend and stand at the opening of the tent, and he would speak with Moses. Now, what's interesting is, he says this, and Yahweh would speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his neighbor. So you can imagine Moses walking into the tent, and then everybody watches him going, okay? And then this cloud comes down on the tent, and then God would have this conversation with Moses, as we're told here, like he would talk to his neighbor, face-to-face discussion. What did that look like?
But what did they say? If you seen the face of God, you probably would.
You would die. Yeah. At one point, he wants to, and God ends up shielding him and says, "You're just going to see my back," and he passes by, right?
Right.
And so there had to be some, quote, veiling that went on that protected Moses from the glory of God that would have just annihilated him. Just, he's gone, right? So what was that? Is it human flesh? Is it the form of a human being? Isn't that a veiling of sorts? Have we ever seen that before? That God would put on human form in order to protect us, but also reveal himself to us so that we could interact with him and talk to him? Sounds like the whole New Testament, doesn't it? Isn't that the whole point of Jesus? God come as human form. He's got flesh. People saw him face to face. They didn't die. Why? Because God shielded himself. He took that glorious piece and he put himself in human form so that he could be having conversations face to face. Now we think of that, wow, that's a New Testament concept. Is it possible that was going on in the Old Testament? What do you call this man God who's meeting with people? What's his name? Well, in the Old Testament,
Would he have come in the form of Jesus? And looked like Jesus at that time?
That's the thought process. It's because we don't have the name Jesus until you get to the New Testament. So what do you call this man who's God in human form that's interacting with people?
Emmanuel?
Yeah, God with us. Yeah, that's true. And we get those New Testament terms because Mary's told, here's what you're going to name him, right? But what was he called before that? I mean, Jesus was around, right? He was been there since the beginning. Has he just been non-existent or has he been involved? He's been involved. So I would suggest that that's who's meeting with him, in human form. That sometimes you got Yahweh in his glorious form, and you got him in human form. Because obviously Abraham saw him on the road and he didn't get killed, right? So there was a veiling that went on at times. Now, I think Moses knew he wanted to see him in his glorified, the Shekinah glory they would call it. He wanted to see the real form. And God's like, you're dead. Like, if you see that, you're gone. You can't see it. Now, I'm thinking about this, okay, and what Ezekiel saw. And he sees this, being on this throne, and there's the storm theophany. We talked about that the first week of the clouds and the lightning and the smoke and, all this stuff. Now, I was thinking about that this week, and I came across this verse, and I think it's not ironic, and I don't think it's a coincidence. After 6 days, Jesus took along Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. That sounds kind of like Sinai-ish, doesn't it? And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun. His clothing became bright as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with them. And while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. Does that not sound like what was going on at the tent of meeting when Moses would go and talk to God? He would go to there, and then what would happen? A cloud would come down, and then he would have a conversation with God face to face. Here's Jesus getting ready about to go to Jerusalem, and he goes up on Mount Hermon, is probably where he's at. He's got his close guys with him, and then what happens? He has a conversation with who? Moses. He's one of them there. And Elijah. See, I don't think that's coincidence. I think that that's who's been talking to him all along. I think that's what he's trying to say, is I was there. He even said, I was there before Abraham. I was there at the beginning. Just something to think about, in regards to what's Ezekiel seeing. Jesus hasn't been born yet in the standpoint of coming, from Mary, but he's around. He's doing stuff. He's still God. Is that who Ezekiel is seeing, is Yahweh with a human form on the throne? Something to think about. Let's go to Ezekiel 2, verse 9. He says, and I looked, and look, there was a hand outstretched to me, and look, it was a scroll with writing. So this is Ezekiel's vision. He sees the image, and now he's kind of taken his attention from the throne chariot, and he's going, I see this hand, and it's got this scroll, handed out to me. Notice this in Jeremiah chapter 1. Then I said, look, Yahweh, look, I do not know how to speak, for I am a youth. But Yahweh said to me, you must not say I am a youth. For to whoever I send you, you will go, and whatever I command you, you will speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares Yahweh. Then Yahweh stretched out his hand and touched my mouth. What's similar between this event and what we just read in Ezekiel? What's happening here? And this is the commissioning of the prophet. Ezekiel's in that very beginning vision, and he's being called that he's going to be the messenger. And God says, here, and puts his hand out with something. And what happens with Jeremiah? He's going, I can't do this, I'm too young. And God says, no. And then he stretches out his hand, but instead of using a scroll, what does he do? Touches his mouth. It's that same, there's a similar piece to that commissioning piece where God stretched out his hand in both cases. Look at this in Daniel chapter 10. And then on the 24th day of the first month, I myself was on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris. It's interesting that God would reveal this stuff while people seem to be like out in nature, sitting on banks of rivers, You wonder if Ezekiel's by the Kibar Canal. You think, is he in the town? Is he actually by the river, like by the canal? And then here you have Daniel. He's out there by the Tigris, and here's what happens. I lifted up my eyes, and I saw, and there was a man, and he was dressed in linen, and his waist was girded with the gold of Uphaz. Now his body was like turquoise, his face was like the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like torches of fire, and his arms and legs were like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words was like the sound of a multitude. So when Daniel is standing out there, he sees what Ezekiel also describes. Remember how he talks about how his, from basically waist down, it was like burning like bronze, gleaming fire almost. Daniel's seeing the same thing. In this instance, you have a lot of the same, this fiery person with the eyes of fire, and he's just very glowing, right? He's glowing. And it's very similar to what Ezekiel saw. It's very similar to what John sees. Right? But yeah, he shows up. God is spirit, but he does show up in human form. As weird as that is. So here's the question. What does it take to be a prophet? Okay, we know God shows up in human form. So Ezekiel's going to be called to be a prophet. Now, I actually got a call about 2 weeks ago, of someone who was asking me about this individual they had heard about online. Someone at work had shared with them, and this individual online claimed that they were a modern day prophet. And the question was, what do you think about this? So we're going to answer that a little bit because it's important to what we're talking about. We kind of went through some of these things. My initial response is I'm usually skeptical. I'm always the skeptic first, right? But I think this pretty much answers it. What does it take to be a prophet? It goes for Ezekiel, it goes for any of them. Well, here's Ezekiel chapter 2. And he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet so that I can speak with you. And the Spirit came into me as he was speaking to me, and it set me on my feet, and I heard the one speaking to me. And he said to me, Son of man, I'm sending you to the Israelites, to nations who are rebelling, who rebelled against me. They and their ancestors, they transgressed against me until this very day. So the first thing that happens is you have a vision. You have something happen, okay, that God gets your attention. Now, we'll get into it here in a second, but one of the key aspects of being a prophet is the commissioning process. You don't get to just call yourself a prophet. I'm sorry, you don't get to do that. There's some very specific things that have to happen. In this case, Ezekiel ends up on his face. He sees the vision before him, and then where does it end? I was basically on my face. It just took me to the ground. And so God has to help him get up so he can say, we got stuff to do. Okay, get up, right? So here's some requirements. What do you think the requirements are for a prophet? If someone said, I'm a modern day prophet, what would you use as your characteristics to verify if they're telling you the truth or not?
You have to be right 100% of the time.
So their accuracy, 100% of the time. Okay, I think, correct predictions of the future, right? 100% accurate. We typically think of prophets as, at least in the biblical standpoint, as all they did was just make predictions. Did they do anything else besides make predictions? They actually do more preaching than they do predicting when you read their writings. They did do some, but it's not as much as they were preaching. They were out there telling people what they should do and what they shouldn't do, and they needed to repent, and they needed to do this, and they needed to do that. They were more like almost like the pound the pulpit fire brimstone preachers than they were just guys out there making prophetic statements like this is going to happen and that's going to happen. That was a smaller portion of what they did. This is a big one. They stood in the counsel of God alone. In other words, what happens? God picks them. They didn't pick God. God picked them. And then what does he have? He invites them into the throne room, and they all end up in the same state, a mess, right? And then he says, get up, I have work for you to do. There's scrolls, there's these things. It's a very formal atmosphere. And the idea is the counsel of God, like where the business happens, you get to kind of be invited into that place, and you get commissioned before you go. You can't just call yourself a prophet because you're a good Bible teacher. I'm sorry, you can't do that. It's not how it works. After the encounter, then they're sent by God, and officially, you're my messenger. But you have to end up in the council first, okay? We talked about that. Prophets teach more than really make predictions. Look at Jeremiah 23. This is a really neat one. He's talking about the prophets. Jeremiah is basically right before Ezekiel in that, Babylon's coming. He's kind of a contemporary of Ezekiel, and he's actually in Jerusalem. He doesn't end up getting taken to Babylon. Okay, he stays in Jerusalem. And God's telling him this stuff, and look what he says. For the land is full of adulterers, for the land mourns because of a curse. The pastures of the desert are dry, and their evil has been their way of running, and their power is not right. For both prophet as well as priest are godless. Even in my temple I have found them found their wickedness, declares Yahweh. Is he real happy with the prophets during the time of the Babylonian exile? Nope, he's not. Look what he says. He says, now in the prophets of Samaria I saw a disgusting thing. They prophesied by Baal, and they caused my people Israel to err. So they're not prophesying from Yahweh. They're not his prophets. They're Baal's prophets in that mind. And in the prophets of Jerusalem I have seen something horrible. They commit adultery, and they walk in lies, and they make strong the hands of evildoers, so that they have not turned back each from his wickedness. All of them have become to me like Sodom, and its inhabitants like Gomorrah. What were the prophets doing that was so bad? What were they telling the people? Keep doing what you're doing. It's going to be just fine. They didn't correct their idolatry. They didn't correct their behavior. They basically said, just keep on. It's fine. It'll be okay. We'll prosper. Don't worry about it. Look what else he says. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, you must not listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you. That sounds terrible, right? You can't even listen to these guys. They are deluding you with visions of their mind, not his mind. They do not speak from the mouth of Yahweh. They are continually saying to those who disregard the word of Yahweh, peace it will be to you. And to each one who walks in the stubbornness of his heart, they say, calamity will not come upon you. So they're people that like to tell everybody what they want to hear. That's what they have turned into, right? He goes on to say this, for who has stood in the counsel of Yahweh that he has seen and heard his word? That's a key point. Who has listened attentively to his word and heard it? Who has been commissioned? Have you stood in the council and listened and seen him? Because I don't think you're just going to walk away and be like, oh yeah, no big deal. You can't just claim that. It's an amazing event. That's what Ezekiel experienced. Here's Daniel chapter 10. And I saw Daniel, alone. Notice he says that? Alone, the vision, and the people who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled in order to hide themselves. So you get these prophetic visions. If you're the prophet and God says, okay, throne room time, show up right here. It's like everybody else scatters because he's getting this and no one else is invited in. I myself, Daniel alone, saw this great vision, and as a result, no strength was left in me, and my complexion grew deathly pale, and I did not retain any strength. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? And I heard the sound of his words, and when I heard the sound of his words, I myself began falling into a trance on my face with my face to the ground. Sounds like Ezekiel. He sees him on the throne, boom, he's on his face. You don't just say, oh yeah, I got invited to the throne room and God gave me a vision and I'm good. No, you're a mess afterwards. It's completely revolutionary when it comes to just how it impacts you. Puts you down. Look at Isaiah. In the year of the death of Uzziah the king, I saw the Lord sitting on high and a raised throne, and the hem of his robe was filling the temple. What has he got on? A robe. Do spirits wear robes? People wear robes. That's human, kind of more human type language, right? Seraphs were standing above him, and the pivots of the threshold shook from the sound of those who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, woe to me, for I am destroyed. Does it sound like Isaiah is really happy? I'm dead. That's it. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I am living among a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of hosts. And he said, go and say to this people. And then, see, the commissioning piece. He's a mess. And then he says, get a grip. A lot of times he had to help him get a grip. And then, I got something I need you to go tell him. Right? Now, I don't know if this matches. Because I don't know if Paul would qualify himself as a prophet. Okay? But I read this week and I find this too comparable and too similar to just avoid. Now, as he was proceeding, it happened that when he approached Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter into the city, and it will be told to you what you must do. That sounds similar, doesn't it? Now, it's interesting because what happens to the guys that are with Paul or Saul at the time? They don't see anything, but they heard and they're terrified. Sounds like Daniel a little bit. People are running for cover because they know something's going on, but there's only one person that's commissioned. Now the men who were traveling together with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. So Saul got up from the ground, but although his eyes were opened, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus, and he was unable to see for 3 days, and he did not eat or drink. You think it messed him up a little?
Yeah.
What happens to Ezekiel? I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but Ezekiel gets this vision, and what happens after it's concluding? What happens to Ezekiel, this first vision? He ends up going into the tribes there at the Kibar Canal, and he doesn't move from his house for 7 days. He's stunned for 7 days. If you haven't had an experience like this, I'm not sure if I would say you're a commissioned prophet. Ezekiel 3 right here. And the Spirit lifted me and took me, and I went in bitterness in the heart of my spirit, and the hand of Yahweh was strong on me. And I went to the exiles at Tel Aviv, who was dwelling near the Kibar River, and I sat where they were dwelling. I sat there 7 days in the midst of them, stunned. You don't just say, I'm a prophet. There's more to it than that. These guys, I would venture to say many of them were reluctant. They're going, why me? Why me? Think of Jonah. Why me? And they're going, I don't know about this. You have just changed my whole world, impacted my whole life, and they can't even function days after. Now, is Paul a prophet? I don't know if I would necessarily, I guess you may be able to make a case for that. He has a similar experience, but what is he commissioned to do? I have a message, and who's it for? The Gentiles. And he goes, and he's the greatest evangelist, in history. Maybe Billy Graham reached more people, but he went out. That was his mission. He had a calling, and he did it. Let's look at God's words to Ezekiel briefly. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet so I can speak with you. And the Spirit came to me, and he was speaking to me, and it set me on my feet. And I heard the one speaking to me, and he said to me, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to nations who are rebelling, who rebelled against me. They and their ancestors, they transgressed against me until this very day. Now, this is the second, remember, Ezekiel goes in like the second wave. This isn't like the first time Israel and Judah have been hammered. In fact, Israel doesn't even exist anymore at this time. Did you realize that? They've been gone 150 years. Who's left at the time of the Babylonian conquest? Judah. And so it's the tribes in Judah. It's the people left. That's who, because when you went to Israel in the north, what was their capital? Samaria. And you had Jerusalem in the south. Okay? And so Israel's gone. They've been defeated. So who's left? Judah. And yet, God uses the phrase nation of Israel over and over when he's talking to Ezekiel. But Israel's been gone for years. But he still looks at the whole thing. Not just Judah, not just Israel, but his whole nation, all the tribes. Okay? But he's specifically talking about how you guys have been judged. This is the second wave now, and he says, even to this day, you're still transgressing. You haven't even learned after you got your spanking. This is essentially what he's saying. And the children are impudent and stubborn, and so I am sending you to them, and you must say to them, Thus says the Lord Yahweh, and they, whether they listen or whether they fail to listen, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet was in their midst. Notice how he uses that language. It doesn't matter if they listen or they don't. I'm sending you anyway. But Ezekiel's probably going, what a waste of time. They're not going to listen. God's going, it doesn't matter if they listen. Goes on to say this in verse 6, And you, son of man, you must not be afraid of them, and you must not be afraid of their words, because briars and thorns are with you, and you are sitting among scorpions. Let's pause there. Sounds terrible, right? That scorpion's word could be scorpions, or it could actually be a word for another thorny bush that they had. There's debate on what it means. But what is he saying? Not that you're going to be sitting among thorns, but that they're going to be around you. In other words, all these people, yes. So have you ever heard we use this Christian term, hedge of protection. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
This is it, okay? God's going to protect him by setting up these barriers where people can't get through to keep him safe. Don't be afraid, he says, right? Don't be afraid of their words, and you must not be dismayed because of their looks, for they are a rebellious house, and you must speak my words to them, whether they listen or whether they fail to listen, for they are rebellious. Do you get the theme? God's saying, what are they? Rebellious. They're rebellious. They're stubborn. They don't listen. But you're going to go anyway. And I'm going to protect you. Now notice he says a couple things to him. To Ezekiel specifically. He says, I don't want you to be afraid of, and then he tells him a few things. They're threats. So in other words, you better zip it, Ezekiel, or we're going to take you out. And he says, that shouldn't quiet you down. Then he also says their words. Are they going to attack him? Maybe politically, or they're going to try to diminish him with their words, maybe not physical threats so much. He also says their looks. Don't be afraid of their looks. Why would he say that? Do you think a prophet, we think these prophets were like these superhuman people. They're humans, and they've been commissioned to take their humanity and go and do something for God. And there's people that are going to look down on that, and they're going to look at them like they're nuts, and look at them like they don't know what they're talking about. And if you're a human like any other human, you might take that personal and say, I don't know if I should keep doing this. And so the psychological piece of interacting with the community was going to potentially take a toll on Ezekiel, and God had to tell him, protect your mind from it. I'll protect you physically, but you also got to understand we're going to have to protect you mentally, emotionally, because the people are not going to receive this well. Tells him not to be afraid of rejection of his word. That's kind of a weird thing to say, because I would expect God to hopefully get compliance, but he doesn't get compliance, does he? Yet he speaks anyway. He talks to them knowing that they're not going to listen. I'm the type that's like, if I know you're not going to listen, I'm not going to waste my time, right? He does that anyway. God tells Ezekiel not let those around him through fear impact his message to be delivered. Don't be afraid. Go do what I told you to do. God will set thorns around him for protection. Here's verses 8 through 10. And you, son of man, hear what I'm speaking to you. You must not be rebellious like the house of rebellion. Uh-oh. There's the warning. Open your mouth and eat what I'm giving you. And I looked, and look, there was a hand stretched out to me, and look, in it was a scroll with writing. And he rolled it out before me, and it was written on the front and back, and there was written on it laments and mourning and wailing. Yeah, it looks great, right? Notice he tells him, open your mouth and eat what I'm giving you. He's probably thinking, oh, I'm going to get some, bacon, or no, not bacon. Something good. Honey, Instead, what does he get? Probably a papyrus scroll. Eat this. Eat it. And he lays it out before him. And the idea of this scroll thing, we're going to talk about it here in a second, it is not unknown in the ancient world. When they wrote contracts, when they wrote important things, they put them on scrolls. When they had a commissioning ceremony, certificates, scrolls were completed. They were sealed. Okay. He goes on to say, there was a hand stretched out to me, and look, in it was a scroll with writing, and he rolled it out before me, and it was written on front and back. There were written on it laments and mourning and wailing. What do you think's written on this? We know here what it is. What does it say? Is it the judgment on Jerusalem? The judgment on Israel that he's having to read? What was specifically written on the scroll is a good question. Look at this in Revelation chapter 5. And I saw on the right hand of the one who's seated on the throne a scroll written inside and on the back, sealed with up with 7 seals. Saw a powerful angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the scroll and to break its seals? And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And one of the elders said to me, he says, don't weep, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. But what's the key here? What's on the scroll? What is so terrifying about him not getting this open? We don't know. It doesn't tell us specifically what's written, but I think we can guess that it's some kind of a law or a record or a judgment or something about the earth, about humanity. I mean, John's disturbed. He's in tears because we can't get this thing open. Apparently, it's important. Now, I want you to think of it from a broader kind of in the council of God as they're standing there. Here's John now, and what's he kind of getting the prophetic commissioning? He's standing there and he sees the scroll that they're having this meeting, and it's like, guys, we have work to do. Who's going to take care of this? And they can't find anybody until who? Jesus shows up. I can take care of it. I can fulfill the contractual obligations. I have the authority to open the scroll. It's that same idea of the scroll with God's declaration written on it. It's complete, it's sealed, and it has to be initiated, carried out. In this case, we know what it was. It was probably sin. What's going to be the requirement? Everybody's toast, right? Until the Lion from the tribe of Judah shows up. Okay. Ezekiel 3 says, and he said to me, Son of man, what you find, eat. Ooh, doesn't look good. Eat this scroll and go. Speak to the house of Israel. And I opened my mouth. And he gave me this scroll to eat. And he said to me, Son of man, you must give your stomach this to eat. You must fill your belly with the scroll that I am giving you. And I ate, and it became like sweet honey in my mouth. Never eaten paper and had it taste like honey, I guess, He actually, the phrase is, I want you to eat this, and I want you to keep it down. Fill your stomach with it. Keep it down. You eat paper, a whole scroll, it may not sit real well, and so the idea is keep it down. That's kind of the phrasing. Why did God make Ezekiel eat it? What's the meaning?
It would be inside of him.
I want my word in you. It's going to come out of you. It is one with you now. This phrase, did you know there's no Hebrew word for brain? And so they understood your locus of thought was your stomach, your innards, your liver, your kidneys. Those places were where you did your thinking because they didn't understand brain. They didn't have a word for it. So he says, I want you to put it into your stomach. What could that mean from their perspective? Get it in here. To us, let's get it in here. To them, get it in here. They believed that the stomach was the place of thought. Here's Ezekiel 3 and 4. He said to me, Son of man, come to me. Go to the house of Israel. You must speak to them with my words, for you are sent to the house of Israel, not to a people of obscure speech or of a difficult language, not to many nations of obscure speech and a difficult language, whose words you do not understand. Notice what he says here. If I had sent you to them, they would have listened to you. If I sent you to somebody else, they would have listened. But the people that understand you, they aren't going to listen to you. And come, go to the exiles, to the children of your people, and you must speak to them and say to them, Thus says the Lord Yahweh, whether they listen or whether they fail to listen. I want you to take my words that I have written on this scroll, front and back, it's complete, and you're going to become one with my word, and you're going to go deliver that to everybody else. That's the messaging of the scroll. Eat it, consume it. It's now part of your being, and I want you to keep it down, and I want you to go out there and tell people the words that I've given you. How does Ezekiel respond? Yahoo! I'm the prophet! Yes, yes! No, not the case. The Spirit lifted me and took me, and I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit, and the hand of Yahweh was strong on me. You know, it says heat of my spirit. That's actually a different phrase. I'll show you that in a second. So there it is. Heat of my spirit. Hebrew. That's the word. Now, it means angry. So when he says, I went in bitterness, he says, I'm angry and I'm bitter after what happened to me. Ezekiel actually uses this term almost half of all the times in the Old Testament. I think there's like 80 some usages. He's almost half of them. So how does he respond to this calling of God? Used elsewhere to actually, by Ezekiel uses it again, but it's in the terms rage, wrath, anger. Same Hebrew word. Okay? So he's stunned and unwilling to go, potentially. Now I put the unwilling to go because we know he's stunned, right? But you notice he said there, I sat there for 7 days. Well, after 7 days is up, look there. I sat there 7 days in the midst of them stunned, and then it happened at the end of 7 days, the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, I can see him just wagging his finger maybe. I have appointed you as a watchman for the house of Israel. When you hear a word from my mouth, then you must warn them from me. Because what did he do? He went home and sat for 7 days going. And God's going, what are you doing? Stunned is this word, salem, okay? It means to be left desolate or appalled. Yeah, I think that makes sense from what he just saw. Verse 18, when I say to the wicked, surely you will die, and you do not warn him, and you do not speak to warn the wicked from his wicked ways so that he may live, that wicked person will die because of his guilt, but from your hand I will seek his blood. 7 days he's sitting there not doing anything, and God says, I told you to go, and if you don't do it, you're going to carry some of the guilt here. You're going to be somewhat responsible. Is it possible evidence in this verse that Ezekiel wanted no part in this? Do you think you want to be a prophet? I would venture to say I don't think you have any idea what the weight you're about to carry is. Ezekiel was unique because Ezekiel wasn't the one who went and shared. He had to live what God was speaking. I think that's part of that consuming the scroll. When God tells him later when his wife dies and he says, don't mourn for her. You're forbidden to mourn. It's because of what? Israel has died. Spiritually dead. And God's saying, I'm not mourning, you don't get to mourn for either when your wife dies. My wife has abandoned me. Israel is gone. No mourning. He has to live it out in his own life, what being a prophet is. He doesn't just get to set it and then go home at 5 o'clock and be like, done with that for the day, It's not how it works. And when the righteous turns from his righteousness and does injustice, and I place a stumbling block before him, he will die, for you did not warn him. Because of his sin he will die, and his righteousness that he did will not be remembered, and his blood I shall seek from your hand. Yikes. And if you warn him, the righteous, not to sin, and the righteous does not sin, surely he will live, for he heeded a warning, and you will have saved your life. In other words, you're a prophet of mine, and you have a mission to go tell people. And if you don't do it, you're going to have responsibility in what happens with these people. So I don't know if Ezekiel was totally on board, at least initially. Jeremiah 15, your words were found and I ate them. This is when Jeremiah gets commissioned. Look what he says. I ate your words. Okay? And your words became to me as jubilation, even as the joy of my heart, for your name is called on me. O Yahweh, God of hosts, I sat not in the assembly of jokers, nor did I exult because of the presence of your hand. What? I sat alone, for you filled me with indignation. It wasn't like you were the popular one if you were the prophet. You consume the word of God and you have to go deliver it. People don't really want to have much to do with you. So I just want to give you some thoughts for this week as we wrap up. Being a prophet of God was not an easy task. Anybody that just claims they're a prophet, I don't know. Because I don't know that I would want that. After what I read, I don't know if I would want that weight. I think it would be something that is a blessing to some degree. But I don't know. I don't know on that one. Be tough. It took a toll on the individual in many aspects. Their families suffered. They suffered. They were not well received. A lot of them were killed. Ezekiel may have realized what this all meant, and he was having a struggle to embrace it. He knows what a prophet is. He knows what the Old Testament says. And when he just saw Yahweh on his throne, and he's now on his face, and God says, eat the scroll, I have a message for you. You wonder if Isaiah's resounding in his mind and others, and he's going, I don't know if I want the end that they have. I don't know if I want to have to do this. I don't think I can do it. Yeah. Why does God have to tell him not to be afraid? Because he's probably going to be afraid at some point, right? Regardless of what Ezekiel felt, God had a mission for him and expected it to be accomplished. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Doesn't matter how you feel about it. What's more important is the word that God has given. That needs to go out regardless of how you feel about it. God sent a warning despite knowing that they wouldn't listen to him. I struggled with that one this week. Why would you do that? Why would you send a warning to people you knew wouldn't listen? There's some that will, but he keeps saying over and over again, they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to listen to you. Why would God do that?
He's a caring God.
That's exactly right. He's a loving, caring God. I kept thinking about this, and you have to remember, God sent Christ and forerunners before him and evidence, yet he knew some would not receive him. But he did it anyway, right? And so I came across this verse as well. While we were still helpless, yet at the proper time Christ died for the ungodly. For only rarely will someone die on behalf of a righteous person, for on behalf of a good person possibly someone might even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. See, God wants to do it by the book. He wants to do it right, regardless of what we do. That's a wonderful thing. To think that God is not bound to say, you know what, I'm not going to declare to them because I know they're not going to listen to me. He will declare to us even if we never respond, so that because it's the right thing to do. It's the part of his character that is love and care and honesty and truth. I'm going to tell you the truth, even if you do nothing with it. You will not be able to say you never heard.